Hello, my name is Dr. Alan Detton, and in this lecture I will be going over an introduction to the joints. By the end of this lecture, you will be able to list and define the major classifications of joints as fibrous, cartilaginous, and synovial, and provide examples of each. You will be able to describe the major features and defining characteristics of a synovial joint. And lastly, identify the different types of synovial joints: hinge, pivot, saddle, condyloid, plane, and ball and socket, and provide examples of each while listing the movements allowed. A joint is defined as a point at which two or more bones articulate, meaning where they meet up and come in contact one with another. Now, despite what you might think, not all joints actually need to move, so it's simply going to be a point where the bones meet or articulate again that makes it a joint. Now, we can classify the different joints throughout the body in two different ways. We could look at them structurally, meaning what are the pieces of connection formed by, or functionally, looking at what kind of movement they allow. So we'll be discussing the movements that are allowed at each joint, but primarily we're going to look at them as a structural type of subdivision. So we're looking at what physically is connecting these together. And for this type of organization, there are three different types of joints. The first are fibrous joints. Now, a fibrous joint is going to be where they're connected by tough fibrous tissue, and we'll look at this in more detail. But predominantly, these are not very mobile. A synovial joint, on the other hand, is quite mobile. These are the types of joints that we really think of when we look at the joints throughout our body. And there's going to be certain characteristics of how these types of joints are formed and what makes them. So we're going to spend a lot of time looking at synovial joints. Lastly, we're going to see cartilaginous joints, and as their name would imply, these are going to be connected by cartilage, in particular fibrocartilage or hyaline cartilage. And so these are going to be excellent shock absorber type of joints, and we'll see examples of them throughout this lecture as well. Fibrous joints. Fibrous joints are connected by fibrous connective tissue, as its name would imply. Now, fibrous connective tissue is really strong, it's often quite dense and inflexible, and thus allows little to no movement. A fibrous joint is also known as a synarthrotic joint or a synarthrosis. The terms syn and arthros mean respectively together and joint. So a synarthrotic joint is a type of joint that allows little to no movement, as the bones or the structures are in very close contact to one another. What we'll see is that there's actually three different types of synarthrotic joints. The first of them that we're going to look at is a suture. And sutures are going to be found between the various flat bones of the skull, and their primary role is going to be to protect the underlying brain. So you can imagine that these bones are going to need to not move in order to serve that all-important function. So there's a couple of key characteristics that these bones, or in particular the sutures between the bones, have to help serve this role. Now, the first of which we're going to take a look at is the increased surface area of these bones. And what I mean by that is if you were to draw a straight line and picture that these bones were interacting one with another along that straight edge, there's going to be a limited amount of points of contact for those two bones, and it could even allow a certain amount of slipping or movement. Now, if I were to take the same length of line and curl it or bend it, it's going to have more points of contact, and it's going to allow a lot more stability where these bones are going to interdigitate or interlock, kind of like your fingers if you're going to place them against each other. So this interlocking pattern is very characteristic of sutures. The other thing that sutures are going to have to help reinforce and strengthen them is the actual connective tissue. Now, all bones throughout the body are going to have a lining that is known as periosteum. And the periosteum here is going to extend from one flat bone to the other. And it's actually going to extend down into those thin cracks between the adjacent bones. So you can imagine that the periosteum, or the lining of the bone, is going to extend down into these fine, thin crevices and increase the contact and connection points between those two adjacent bones. And so basically what we're going to have is a reinforcement on the outer surface between the bones themselves, and actually it's going to also be on the inner surface. So if I were to hide one of these bones and the brain itself, and we were to picture this on the inner aspect, now what we're going to see is that there's going to be a continuous layer on the inside of the skull as well. And here the periosteum gets a specific name. It's known as the periosteal layer of the dura. However, it serves the same function. It's going to be the connective tissue extending from one bone to the other and connecting with the connective tissue in the actual suture line. So this is going to be a really key factor in strengthening and reinforcing these different joints along the suture lines of the skull. Now again, recall that the primary purpose of these bones in this region where the sutures are is to protect the underlying brain. So there's going to be bones that help form the skull base or the cranial fossa, the floor of the skull on the inside, as well as on the superior aspect forming part of the calvaria. Now these we'll get into in more detail later on, as well as the functions of the bones in the face, which help to protect the eyes, maintain the openings of the nasal and oral cavities. But just remember that these sutures are going to be the specific joints that are going to be forming here between the bones of the skull. The second type of fibrous or synarthrotic joint after sutures is also found within the head, and this joint is known as a gomphosis. Now, a gomphosis is going to be the joint that is formed between the roots of our teeth and the surrounding bone, either the mandible or the maxilla. And what we will see is that each individual tooth is going to have its own socket. So if we were to draw using our 3D pen tool, we can draw the outline and basic shape of one of these sockets. And what we'll see is that the socket is going to extend down into the surrounding skeletal structures of the mandible or the maxilla. And attaching from the socket to the actual root itself are small ligaments. And these ligaments are known as periodontal ligaments. And the periodontal ligaments are going to be responsible for keeping that tooth held firmly in place within our oral cavity. Now, as all of you are likely aware, there is going to be two different sets of teeth that grow during development. We often refer to these as primary or baby teeth and secondary or permanent teeth. Now, the primary set of teeth are actually in the oral cavity, or I should say will be already formed within the baby at birth. However, they have not yet extended out into the oral cavity and have not yet erupted. So what we would see is the actual tooth would be sitting deep to the gums, but it would actually already be present within either the mandible or the maxilla. And as the teeth begin to grow, they are going to erupt typically around the age of 6 months old. And I'm going to go out on a limb that most of you don't remember your own teeth growing in, but if any of you have children or ever been around a baby, then you know that the process of teething can be quite painful. Now, as we grow, our primary teeth are going to fall out, and they are going to be replaced by our secondary teeth later in life. Now, this is usually going to begin around the age of 6 or 7 as our primary teeth start to fall out, and by the age of 10 to 13, our adult teeth are going to grow back in. Now, what we're going to see is that this process is incredibly complex, and we don't really need to get into that much detail today. But for our purposes, I just want to emphasize that the root of each tooth is going to be responsible for holding that tooth firmly in place with the surrounding bone through the periodontal ligaments. So if there's no root, there is no ligament to then hold that in place. Now, the third type of fibrous joint that we're going to actually take a look at is going to be found in the extremities. And this third type of joint is known as a syndesmosis. And a syndesmosis is going to be found between the long bones either in the forearm or in the leg. And what we're going to see is there's a strong fibrous connective tissue sheet that is going to be extending from these long bones within these regions. And in the leg, it's going to be found between the tibia and the fibula. And the primary role of this is to prevent these bones from separating from one another. So we don't want there to be any ability for the fibula to move away from the tibia. And especially this is going to be important for stability at the ankle. Now, as we come up back to the forearm, what we're going to see is there's going to be a fair amount of rotational movement that is going to be allowed here at the wrist, but we want to keep the bones close to one another in this region as well. The primary stability at the wrist is a little different than at the ankle, and we'll see that later on. But I also want to emphasize that the syndesmotic joints, or specifically these interosseous membrane, are also going to serve as sites of muscle attachment. So the bones are not going to be able to separate, and the surrounding musculature can attach to these strong fibrous connective tissue elements that we're going to see as part of these syndesmotic joints. Cartilaginous joints. As the name implies, cartilaginous joints are joined by cartilage, and the two types of cartilage that are going to join these joints are either hyaline or fibrocartilage, and this is going to determine which type of cartilaginous joint it is. Now, a cartilaginous joint is also known as an amphiarthrotic joint, and this is different than a fibrous joint in that it has a little bit of movement. Whereas a fibrous joint was immobile, these have a slight amount of movement within the joint. Now, what we're going to see is that there are two different types of cartilaginous joints depending on the type of cartilage. The first type is a primary, also known as a synchondrosis. Now, a primary or a synchondrosis type of cartilaginous joint is going to be joined by hyaline cartilage. Now, this is in most of these long bones of the body a plate of hyaline cartilage, which is actually the location of the growth plates. So I've drawn here on top of the bone a depiction of where the growth plate would be found if we were to cut inside of that long bone. Now, the growth plate itself is made of hyaline cartilage, and it's located between the epiphysis and the diaphysis of the long bones. So we're going to find a growth plate both proximally, and we would actually find another one distally at each of these different long bones throughout the body. And typically what we're going to see is that these growth plates are going to be more distinct and pronounced early on in life. And then as we age and we get older, these pieces of cartilage are actually going to be replaced by bone. And that's what's going to determine the length of the bone itself. So the actual pieces of cartilage are going to gradually be replaced by bone as the bones lengthen and extend from the central shaft of the diaphysis out towards the distal ends or the epiphyses, both distally and proximally. So as we age, these diaphysis, or the diaphysis of each bone, is going to get longer, and it's going to start to separate where the two growth plates are. But at some point, that process is going to end, and the growth plates are going to gradually be replaced by bone, and that's what's going to determine the overall length of that actual long bone in the body, which then affects the overall height of our entire skeleton. So these growth plates are made of cartilage, and that is what's going to form these primary or synchondrotic joints. Now, the second type of a cartilaginous joint is known as a symphysis. And a symphysis is going to be located between bones, and it's going to actually have a fibrocartilage pad. And this is going to allow limited amounts of movement, but offers a high amount of stability. So we can see here at the pubic region that there is a specific point of attachment between the right and the left pubic bones. And that is going to be across this fibrocartilage pad known as the pubic symphysis. So this is the symphysis type that we find at the pubis. The other type of a secondary cartilaginous joint is going to be at the intervertebral discs. And what we're going to see here is that the vertebrae are going to be attached to one another by these fibrocartilage pads known as intervertebral discs. And there's going to be two components to each disc, which we'll talk about later. But you can see here that the periphery of each pad is going to be made up of this tough, dense connective tissue known as fibrocartilage, while the inner aspect of this is going to be made up of a more gelatin-like structure, the nucleus pulposus, and that's what's going to offer the shock-absorbing capacity of these discs. But the actual connection that offers the strength and the limited mobility here in the vertebral region is going to be those fibrocartilage pads, known as the intervertebral discs. Synovial joints. Synovial joints are the most common type of joint in our body, and in most cases are what we think of when we hear the word joint. So you instinctively may think of your shoulder, or the elbow, the wrist, the hip, or the knee, or some other part of your body. And that's really what's going to be a synovial joint. So they're very abundant, and it's got a lot of characteristics that we're going to go over in more detail later on. But for right now, I want to get across the concept that this type of joint, a synovial joint, is going to be freely mobile, and it's also going to be called diarthrotic. So di is going to be multiple, and arthros means joint. So this is a joint that can move in multiple directions, and it's going to be very mobile and or freely mobile, quote unquote, as it's able to move in a large variety of different types of motions. Now, a general characteristic that I want to discuss when we talk about synovial or diarthrotic joints is this concept that as a joint becomes more mobile, it is going to be less stable. So let's compare our shoulder to the hip. The hip is going to be a perfect example of a less mobile joint that offers more stability. So this is going to be an inverse relationship. As we start to gain mobility, we're going to lose stability. Or you could think of it as we become less mobile, it's going to become more and more stable. So let's look at the shoulder first. And what we're going to see if we activate one of these muscles and turn on its motion, we're going to see the action of AB or abduction. And you can see the wide range of motion that our upper limb offers here at the shoulder joint. We're able to have the upper limb positioned down by the side of our body, all the way out, and then above our heads. And this is going to be a great example of a highly mobile joint, but one that is often quite unstable. Now, you may know somebody, or you may have experienced this yourself, of a shoulder dislocation, and they're fairly common. Now, the reason why is as we look at this, it's a type of joint known as a ball and socket joint. And here we see that the ball is much, much larger than its accompanying socket. And what this means is we're going to have a high degree of movement offered at this joint, but it's also going to be quite unstable because it allows for so much mobility. Now, that's going to be different than what we're going to see here at the hip. And if we were going to AB or abduct the hip, what we would see is a far more restricted range of motion. Now, obviously, some individuals are incredibly flexible and they might be able to continue to raise that lower limb quite far. But this shows this example quite well, that this is a far more stable joint, but it's also far more immobile. We can see that the head of the femur is going to be the ball of this ball and socket joint, and it's going to fit in a cup in the hip. And this is going to form a very tight connection, and it's going to be very, very strong, which is good because it's going to allow for weight transfer from our lower limb up to the vertebral column. Now, the difference in these is we have different desires of being a bipedal creature, of walking around, but also being able to move our hands in a wide variety of orientations. So the way that these joints have developed is going to give you an idea of their function. But just remember that concept of more mobility, which is less stability, and less mobility, which equals more stability, for overall concepts of synovial or diarthrotic joints. There are 5 common characteristics to all synovial joints throughout the body. The first is going to be the presence of articular cartilage. Now, articular cartilage is going to line the ends of the bones where they meet with one another, and this is going to overlay the articular surfaces of these bones. So if we were to take a look at any of these types of joints, we're going to see the presence of these articular surfaces that are going to be lined by this thin glass-like layer of hyaline cartilage. And this is going to be there to help reduce the friction where the ends of the bones meet one another. So that's going to be the first common characteristic of all of these types of joints, is the presence of this articular cartilage. Now, the second, we're going to need to turn back on some of the surrounding structures. And we can see that there's going to be a fibrous or articular capsule that is going to connect from one bone to the other. And the important thing here is that this fibrous or articular capsule needs to surround the areas where the articular cartilage were. So it's going to arch from, in this case, the scapula to the humerus, and that's going to pass over the areas where the articular cartilage overlaid those articulating surfaces. So this is going to be a layer of connective tissue that is going to be connecting from each bone involved at that joint. Now, deep to this layer, we're going to see the third component of these types of joints, and that is going to be the synovial membrane. So if we were to hide this layer of the articular capsule, we can see that deep to it is going to be another layer that lines the inner aspect of that fibrous capsule, and that's going to be the actual synovial membrane. Now, the synovial membrane in some cases is also going to wrap around the surrounding tendons, or tendons that will pass through the actual joint capsule, like we see here in the shoulder. But the synovial membrane is going to line the inner aspect of that capsule, and it's going to be made up of the soft tissue that is going to surround the inner aspect of the joint. Now, if we were to take a look inside of that actual membrane, we could cut a window and take a look inside of this space. And what we're going to see is there's a cavity or an area inside the joint that is going to be between the areas of the articular cartilage and the surrounding synovial membrane. and this is going to be the joint cavity. So the joint cavity is going to be that space inside the joint which allows the movement and mobility to occur. Now, in order to reduce the friction that we see inside of these potential areas, we've already lined it with cartilage, we have a membrane on the outside, but the last thing that we're going to do is add a layer of synovial fluid. And this fluid is going to be secreted by the synovial membrane, and it's going to fill inside of that joint space. And the synovial fluid is going to further limit the friction inside of that joint. Now, that's its primary role, is to reduce friction. It's also going to act as a shock absorber and a means of delivering oxygen or nutrients to the surrounding cartilage. And it even actually helps to remove some of the waste products from the cartilage itself in that joint. So there's going to be a lot of different characteristics to these joints. So remember that there are these 5 different components. First, there is the presence of the articular cartilage. Second, the fibrous or articular capsule. Third, the synovial membrane itself. Fourth, the joint cavity. And finally, the synovial fluid within that joint cavity space. Synovial or diarthrotic joints are going to be named according to their basis of movement. And there are going to be 6 different types of diarthrotic or synovial joints. The first is a hinge joint. Now, a hinge joint is going to allow for movement in one plane. And this is what we're going to see at the elbow or at the ankle or even in a modified version at the knee. But this is only going to allow for movement within that one plane to either flex or extend. The second type of synovial joint is going to be at the base of the skull, and this is what we're going to see as a pivot joint. Now, a pivot joint is going to be different than a hinge joint, and it's going to allow for movement around a single axis. And what we can see here is that there's going to be a lot of muscles that allow for rotational movement of the head around the cervical vertebrae. And this is going to be occurring along one primary axis. And unless somebody has curvature to their spine, this is going to be along the median or mid-sagittal plane. The third type of synovial joint is going to be found in a very specific location, and it's going to be here at the base of the thumb. And this is known as a saddle joint. Now, a saddle joint is going to allow for movement in 2 different planes. So one of the planes is going to be along the axis of the bones, following the path of the tendons as they would flex and extend this joint. The other is going to be along the axis or the plane for adduction and abduction. So this is going to offer movement along the plane in the opposite direction. So these would be moving perpendicular to the opposite action of flexion and extension. So that is going to be a saddle joint, and it is located here at the carpometacarpal joint of the thumb. Now, the next type of joint is quite similar. However, a saddle joint is going to move in 2 planes, while a condyloid joint is going to move actually in 2 axes, or bidirectional movement along those 2 axis points. So here what we can see is the metacarpophalangeal joints are going to allow for a different type of movement, where we can either abduct or adduct and abduct our digits, either closer to or away from the midline along a central axis point of rotation, or we could actually flex and extend these same digits. Now, what you can see here is there's going to be pivot points or axis of rotation for this movement. And that's different than what we saw with the plane type of movement at the saddle joint. Now, the next type of movement is going to be a planar type of joint or a plane joint. And here we can see this is a good example of a synovial joint at the acromioclavicular joint. So where our acromion of the scapula meets up with the clavicle. And this is going to allow for a gliding type of motion at that joint. So as we elevate or do a shoulder shrug, we can see that these bones are going to slide past one another in a nice smooth type of motion known as a gliding type of interaction. So plane joints are going to be found here at the AC joint. They're also going to be found between the different bones of the vertebra as we lean to one side or the other, and between the ribs and the sternum. Now, the last type of joint is a ball and socket joint. And this is going to be the most dynamic type of joint, which allows for the most mobility and types of movement. And it's going to be able to move in many different axes around a common center. So where the head of that ball is going to meet within the socket is going to be the point of rotation. And this could either be an abduction and adduction type of movement, or it could be a rotational type of movement, but it's still going to occur along that central axis point in the middle of that joint. Factors of joint mobility. We are now going to take a closer look at the factors which will affect how a joint is able to move. And the direction that a joint can move is primarily determined by the actual shape of the bones. In particular, the shape of the bones at their articulating surfaces. Now, an articular surface is the fancy word for where the bones actually meet. And if you were to select the ends of each bone where they come in contact one with another, you can see what the different names of these pieces of bone are. And this is going to be derived from the Latin term articulus, which means point of contact. So the joint is going to be determined, or its movement is going to be determined by the shape of these bones at those points of articulation or points of contact. Now, if we wanted to watch this movement in action and see how the joints are actually going to move, you can select to add the muscles in the region. And if I were to add enough muscles till I get to the muscles involved with elbow flexion, I can select one of these muscles, in this case the brachialis, and then watch its motion. If I select the motion and then select elbow flexion, I see that the bones are going to move appropriately. The muscle contracts and the bones result in movement. Now, the actual path that this movement is going to occur on is based on the shape of those articulating surfaces. And what we see is that that's really going to determine the extent not only of how the bone moves, but how much it can move. So we're going to see that the range of motion is going to be the extent that we can have the bones move from one end of the movement process all the way to the other. So this is the range of motion. The path is what was determined by the actual shape of the bone. Now, the actual range of motion is not only going to be affected by the shape of the bone and the distance that can travel along that path, but it's also going to be affected by the other surrounding structures. Now, we've already mentioned the important role that connective tissue is going to play in joint movement and classification. Additionally, the muscles themselves are going to affect how much a joint can move. But there are also other factors in the area, like the other layers of connective tissue or fascia, as well as the fat and the skin over that particular joint. So if we were to use the Discover tool, we could see that we actually have an ability to kind of look deep to the skin and see what the underlying structures are. And what we're going to see is that there's a lot of different structures that are going to be running within this space. I could similarly turn on the arteries, the veins, lymphatics, or even the nerves within this region. And we get a better idea that this is a highly complicated area surrounding that joint. Now, if I have more structures that are going to be within the space that the range of motion would have occurred, we're going to start to limit movement. Now, what I mean by that is if something starts to occupy that space, what would that be? There's two dominant things. First, the muscles themselves could become so large that they start to extend out into the path where the motion would have occurred, and this would limit the movement. Now, a good example of this is a bodybuilder. Somebody that gets so big that their muscles are starting to occupy space that they previously didn't. And you can see that they're going to have a limited range of motion as a result. The other large factor that you would see would be the amount of subcutaneous tissue within a region. And this tissue is going to vary in every individual. Now, if somebody has more fat, they're highly obese, they're going to have a more limited range of motion, again, because the fat starts to extend out into the area that normally the joint would have moved within. So it's now obstructed along its path, and it can no longer follow the same trajectory that it used to in, for example, a thinner individual.